My name is Kirk Gibson. I'm the Director of Development at Shrine Mont, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the building of the Cathedral Shrine of the Transfiguration in Orkney Springs and the beginning of Shrine Mont. On August 6, 1925, Bishop William Cabell Brown consecrated this place where I am right now as the Cathedral Shrine of the Transfiguration. And since that date, this has been the actual cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia, even though our seat is really in Richmond, Virginia. Now, how that came to be is an interesting story, and why we are here in Orkney Springs goes back to really the late 1890s. Robert Atkinson Gibson was consecrated the Bishop of Virginia in 1897, and then in 1902 began service as the actual bishop. And during that first 5 years of his episcopate, he was really interested in finding a place that was quiet and cool and away from Richmond for his families to have summer vacations. And somebody suggested that he come to Orkney Springs and stay in the Stribling Select Boarding House, which is in the actual public square of the original village. And he and his family came and stayed for a few summers in the Stribling boarding house. And then in 1900, a house came for sale way up the hill from the town of Orkney. It was called Tanglewood. And he purchased that property in 1900 for about $1,200. And from that day on, served his work in the summertime in Orkney Springs in Tanglewood. And we're going to pan over real quick to look at Tanglewood, which we now call Gibson Cottage. And that is that large red building to my left. It was a much smaller cottage at the time the bishop bought it. The porches weren't on it or anything like that. It was just a quaint mountain cottage, but it served his purposes until he died in 1919. And then in 1919, his son-in-law, the Reverend Dr. Edmund Woodward, purchased the property from the estate so the family could still use it as their summer retreat. Now, Dr. Woodward, in and of himself, is a very interesting character and a visionary. Early in his career, he served after finishing medical school as a missionary to China. And in 1903, he went to China to build a hospital in the province of Anqing, and built that hospital and ran it from 1903 until 1907. And then in 1907, he came back to Virginia and went to the Virginia Theological Seminary to become ordained as an Episcopal priest. In that 3-year window, Dr. Woodward met Bishop Gibson's daughter Frances, and in 1910 married her, and then promptly took her back to China for some more missionary work, until her health required that they come back to Virginia in 1914. And then from 1914 until the bishop died, Dr. Woodward would serve in many capacities in the Diocese of Virginia to help his father-in-law out, including probably most notably the building of Grace Episcopal Church in the Plains, Virginia, which is another stone building built from local rocks the farmers brought in Fauquier County. Now, after the bishop died in 1919 and Dr. Woodward acquired the property, he began to clear the mess of woods and rocks that earned Tanglewood its name. And with some of the trees that he knocked down in the early 1920s, he built the log cabin, which we'll pan over to real quick, and lived in that log cabin in the summers while the family would still summer in Tanglewood. And if you look at the log cabin, the front 2 rooms, where the porch is and the little bedroom to its right, were the original cabin. And then later on, he built the additional parts of the building and moved in there full time. In 1924, Dr. Woodward began to develop a vision of a church building in Orkney Springs, right here on the Tanglewood property. And he and Frances decided the location right where I'm standing would be a perfect place to build that church. For Bishop Gibson, it was a very special place. It's where he would come and meditate and pray while he was staying here during the summers. And so in 1924, what Dr. Woodward began to build, using the stones that he pulled down the mountain, was the chancel here behind me. And the way he built it was using good old arch technology around a wooden form. And he finished that form in the fall of 1924, just as you see here, and left the form underneath the rocks to cure all winter, 1924 and 25. And then in the spring of 1925, they slowly pulled out the wooden form to see how the stone structure would hold up. I have an aunt who died recently, well, died in the last 10 years, but was around 90 years old, and remembers as a child watching them pull the form out and everybody holding their breath and anxiety that it maybe wouldn't hold. But so far it's held up pretty well. And then in 1925, what Dr. Woodward finished was the frontal here of the cathedral and the bell tower. And the way he built every piece that you see here was literally taking the rocks as he found them up the mountain, sometimes down, dragging them over here, and then fitting them in place as best they would fit. And the way he built the bell tower was basically, there was a ramp right here that went up to a scaffolding, and his help would roll the rocks up to him as he would work around the bell tower, putting it together one rock at a time, moving up. And then, as you see, there are 3 tiers. Inside is a vaulted ceiling up to the second tier, and then he finished the bell tower up there. And you just have to imagine him rolling the rocks up and then placing them in without any cranes or even a block and tackle, I think. It really was just making things fit. And then he finished the frontal here using these huge stones that you see as the pulpit and the lectern over there. And then the font here, which we have covered up for the winter ice, basically was a large stone that legend has it was used by the Indians to carve out, to grind corn. But Dr. Woodward's notes talk about how it took him 5 days to actually chisel out the font as we use it today. Now, there are some important symbols that Dr. Woodward built into the cathedral that I like to mention, because his vision of church and the church community was very global and inclusive. And he put some symbols in this cathedral to reflect that. One symbol that maybe we'll look at in a minute is a piece of cast iron bell in the entranceway to the bell tower. And on that cast iron bell are the Chinese symbols for Holy Catholic Church. Not Roman Catholic Church, but little c, a universal church for everybody to come and worship. And also at the floor, in the base of the chancel here, where the altar is a brick that is unique. It comes from the first brick church built in Jamestown. Dr. Woodward acquired 3 of those bricks somehow. One at the foot of the altar here, one at the foot of the altar in the shelter chapel behind me, and one in the hearth of the rectory's fireplace. And those 3 bricks, as I said, came from the original stone brick structure at Jamestown. And for the Episcopal Church, that's an important symbol, because it was in 1607 that the first Holy Communion was celebrated in the Jamestown colony in 1607. And that was the beginning of the Episcopal Church, that branch of the Anglican Communion for Virginia. And then the last symbol I always like to talk about is up in the chancel itself. Hopefully you can see that the 3rd stone up is a little darker. There are 6 stones on either side of the keystone to the entire chancel. And those will symbolize the 12 apostles, 6 on each side with Christ as the keystone. But the 3rd one, being darker, Dr. Woodward would always say reflected Judas and the dark side that he presents. Now, the cathedral is used every Sunday when we're open at Shrine Mont, which is mid-April through November, for a number of services. In a traditional summer, not like we've had the last couple, typically about 13,000 people will come and worship in our cathedral. It is the bishop's seat, so the Bishop of Virginia will come and hold services here from time to time. But usually it is whoever's coming to stay with us for the summer or for a specific weekend will hold their own services here in the cathedral, sometimes 3, 4, or even 5 in a given Sunday. We do have people who have been baptized and are members of our cathedral, and we also have a number of weddings and funerals that are held from time to time. So that's a little bit about our cathedral and how it got started. So after Dr. Woodward built the cathedral and it was consecrated on August 6, 1925, he began to bring to fruition his vision of what Shrine Mont might be. And at that point, he made an agreement with the Bishop of Virginia to deed the entire property over to the bishop and to the diocese once he had finished it upon his death, which was actually in 1948. And the one caveat he made with the bishop in that relationship is that the Diocese of Virginia would never have direct control of Shrine Mont, that it would only be under the bishop's direct control. And from that time forward, Shrine Mont's relationship with the diocese was always one of operational independence. And still to this day, we receive no subsidies from the church in our operations. Nor can the diocese sell us out from ourselves, should they ever need money. Having said that, Dr. Woodward began to build what is now Shrine Mont. First by finishing the cathedral area itself. And in the 30s, he finished up the backside, or the shelter chapel, so that our parishioners would have a place to worship in the rain. And while the shrine itself and the cathedral are all dedicated to the loving memory of Bishop Robert Atkinson Gibson, Dr. Woodward's father-in-law, the shelter chapel and everything in that part of the cathedral area are all dedicated in loving memory of the Woodward family and all that it meant to him in his growing up. So as I mentioned earlier, in 1919, he purchased Gibson Cottage, which they called Tanglewood at the time, and then he moved full-time into the rectory to build Shrine Mont. And then he began to build the cottages that would make up his original vision of having 120 acres, serving 120 people, with an endowment of $120,000. And his whole idea about that 120 goes back to the biblical story in the book of Acts, when the 120 gathered to select Matthias as the 12th apostle after Judas. And those 120 people gathered together, did some good work in selecting Matthias, and then went out into the world to spread the good news. And that's what Dr. Woodward's vision was of Shrine Mont, that people would come here to recharge their battery and do some good work, but then go back into the world to spread the good news. And to build 120 beds for those 120 people, he first began to build that large log cabin behind me, which was named Crenshaw Lodge, in honor of Fanny Crenshaw, who was the aunt of one of the residents in Orkney Springs, the McElroy family. And they wanted to give money in her honor, so he built Crenshaw for them and for his first guests. He then built a number of cottages and buildings along this side of what was the original Gibson property, and then began to acquire property to finish up the 120 acres. The first piece of land he bought for Shrine Mont was actually from the Orkney Springs Hotel Corporation, which was down in Orkney Springs, and which we'll talk about in great detail later. But he purchased about 100 acres of land from the Hotel Corporation that comprised all of Spring Mountain, once known as Yellow Spring Mountain, and today called Spring Mountain. It really was his vision of that mount. And on top of that mountain, he put a cross that we still have as a platform for folks to come and observe the mountains in the valley, and then started calling it Shrine Mountain from that cross on top of the mountain. After that purchase, he bought a piece of land along the eastern side of the Gibson property from a Judge Newman for $1,200. It had what we call Peterkin Cottage, which we'll look at down on the main central circle. Also a recital hall, and then a lot of property on which Dr. Woodward built 5 or 6 additional cottages and then later meeting spaces. And then through the rest of his time until he died in 48, what Dr. Woodward acquired were a few of the homes on the public circle, which we'll look at in another part of this conversation. And those cottages, combined with what he built up here, gave him his 120 beds and his 120 acres. And he never had the opportunity to raise the $120,000 for the endowment. We're still working on that. Mrs. Woodward died in 1945, and then in 1948 in February, Dr. Woodward died. And at that point, one of his chief lieutenants, Wilmer Mumaw, took over as the administrator, as appointed by the bishop. And then in 1950, the bishop asked Wilmer Mumaw to serve as the director of Shrine Mont, which he did until he retired in 1988. I'm here in the village circle of Orkney Springs to talk a little bit about the history of Orkney Springs and Shrine Mont. Long before Shrine Mont was established in 1925, and even long before the Orkney Springs Hotel was established in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the village of Orkney Springs really sprung up right here where I'm standing. Starting in 1808, a Major Peter Higgins, a Revolutionary War veteran, acquired this property from the estate of Mary MacDonald through her brother, who created the transaction to sell the property. Isaac Height was his name, and that's known throughout the Shenandoah County. But Major Higgins built the original town in a square right where I'm standing, basically laying quarter-acre lots around the exterior of an inner courtyard. And in that courtyard were the 4 original springs of Orkney Springs. We still have 2 here. This building next to me holds the Tea Spring, and a little further to the east is the actual Orkney Spring, or what was called back in the day the Collegiate Spring. There were also 2 other springs in the courtyard. Right here was probably what was known as the Lutheran Spring, and a little further up was the Methodist Spring. The town initially was laid out, as I said, in quarter-acre lots. None of these buildings around here now are original. The oldest building we know of in Orkney Springs is actually a log cabin, which is behind me to my left, way back up on the hill. There was probably a row of those cabins built in the 1800s at some point before the Civil War. After the Civil War, most of these cottages around here were built, and over the years these have been acquired by Shrine Mont to be a part of our facility that we rent out in the summer. 2 of the cottages over here are actually still privately held, and the residents do come up and spend their summers with their families, which is a lot of fun. The original town name of Orkney Springs probably comes about because the original purchaser of the property from Lord Fairfax, Dr. John MacDonald, came from Scotland and has ties to the Orkney Isles. There are some other rumors of different origins of why this is called Orkney Springs, but be that as it is, we are now Orkney Springs, Virginia. Interestingly, in the 1830s, as the town was actually incorporated, it was incorporated as Van Burenville. Apparently, Martin Van Buren came and spoke to the residents in this part of the county at that time, and they were very enthusiastic and decided to name the village for him. But 50 years later, they tried to change the name back to Orkney Springs legally, but the governor at the time vetoed that bill. Despite that, the residents took on the name of Orkney Springs again, which suits it very well to the resorts and the springs that were very popular starting in the 1850s. We are now at the furthest southwestern part of the original town of Orkney Springs, and behind me is Stribling Cottage. The large brown structure is a significant building in Shrine Mont's history because, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, when Bishop Gibson was looking for a summer retreat in 1900, he was sent to stay in the Stribling Select Boarding House. That actually is not the same structure we see here. That burnt down in 1915, and this one replaced it. But the Striblings moved to Orkney Springs in the 1840s. At least that's the story. And it was because one of their family was desperately ill and sickly and needed to get away to the mountains and to the healthier air. And the story is that she lived on to be almost 90 years old once she moved into Orkney Springs, and her family continued to run the boarding house up until the 1970s, when Miss Lucy Kimball, who had inherited the property, gave it to Mont in her estate plans. But Bishop Gibson and his family stayed here really until they bought Tanglewood in 1900 every summer. And another story about Stribling is that later in life, another bishop of Virginia, Bishop Arthur Selden Lloyd, also came and stayed with his family in the Stribling Select Boarding House for a few summers to be with the Gibson family. I'm standing here in Mont, in probably the hub of the original 120 acres that Dr. Woodward built. Behind me is what is now called Tucker Lodge, and it was actually a number of different buildings put together over the years. Dr. Woodward purchased the original property from a Judge Newman in the 1930s, and that piece of land included Peterkin Cottage, which is just over here to my right, the part of the building behind me going all the way up the hill. The building that you see with the bell on it was actually a studio where one of the previous owners had a daughter who wanted to be an opera singer, and he built her that studio so she would have a place to sing that was far enough that he wouldn't have to hear it. And Dr. Woodward turned that studio into a community center, a refectory for the guests of Mont to eat in the summer, and a community center for the residents of Orkney Springs in the wintertime. And then off of that building, he built the building with a chimney, which we now call Brown Hall, and over the years, additional dining rooms that now can seat up to 300 people, family style, when Mont's fully operational. The large annex over behind me to my left is a building built in 1940 called Art Hall. And Dr. Woodward acquired through the estate of his great uncle all his uncle's artwork. John Douglas Woodward, who was the uncle, was a prolific artist, starting his career as an illustrator for various magazines and books in the late 1800s, and then later, after acquiring a significant inheritance, did a number of oil paintings of his favorite landscapes in Europe and the United States. And upon his death, Dr. Woodward suggested to Mrs. Woodward, his aunt, that he would build a space to house the art, since she had no place to put it, and he would have additional meeting space. And so in 1940, using funds that she gave specifically for the care of the art, he built Art Hall, and that still stands as a museum. And we are the curators of 78 pieces of John Douglas Woodward's art and all the illustrations that were made over his career. Now, after Dr. Woodward died in 1948, the Bishop of Virginia asked Wilmer Mumont to be the director of Mont. Actually, to be the administrator in 1948 and then the director in 1950. That was a significant change for Mont for the good. The Mumont family were residents of Orkney Springs, and Wilmer, the director, had served at the hotel in various capacities and worked with Dr. Woodward through the entire building of Mont in the early years. Wilmer served as the director from 1950 until he retired in 1988, spending probably the last 5 or 10 years of his time at Mont overseeing the renovation of the Orkney Springs Hotel property, which we'll talk about in a moment. Upon Wilmer's retirement, the bishop asked Wilmer's son Dick to take over as the director and Dick's brother John to serve as assistant director. And they served in the leadership of Mont until 12 years ago when Dick and John retired and Dick's son Kevin took the reins on as the director of Shrine Mont. And so it's been 3 generations of Mumaws who have taken care of and provided this stewardship to keep us going for the last almost 100 years, coming in 1925. So after the town of Van Burenville was built and incorporated in 1833, the medicinal qualities of the waters in Virginia were beginning to be noted around the East Coast. And there are a number of small hotels built in Orkney Springs in the 1840s and 1850s to kind of serve that clientele. And as the clientele grew, there needed to be a larger facility as a resort. And in the early 1850s, the Orkney Springs Resort Incorporated, with many different names, began to build the facility that you see here now. To my right is the Maryland House, which was the first building of the Orkney Springs Resort Hotel. It was built in the early 1850s over a number of years. And then the building immediately behind the Virginia House, which is the large structure behind me, that building is called the Pennsylvania House, was built, along with a row of cottages called Jersey Row, perpendicular to the main road. Those were all built probably in the 1850s and early before the Civil War. And then all construction ceased during the course of the war between the states. And then in 1865, they began construction again. And in earnest, they began to build in the early 1870s the large structure behind me, which we call the Virginia House. And the story, as I have heard it, is that they about finished the Virginia House in early 1873, when a large wet snow in that spring literally collapsed the entire structure. And they had to start over again, building what I think is a smaller version of the Virginia House. When looking at artist renderings of the time, the Virginia House had a little different facade and looked a little bigger. And I think that might have been the first one. This one, which is 4 stories tall and has very, very high ceilings and accommodations for hundreds of people in the back, was finished in 1875. And from 1875 until really the turn of the century, this was a very popular resort up and down the East Coast. The New York Times wrote about it a couple of times, specifically about how easy it was for the Mid-Atlantic region folks to get here. A simple train ride to Newmarket or Mount Jackson, followed by a 3-hour stagecoach ride into Orkney Springs on what was then called the Howard's Lick Turnpike, I believe. From the turn of the century up until the Depression, it was still a very popular resort, but not quite as financially sound as it was earlier on. And then after the Depression, this resort unfortunately began to see a downturn into the 1970s, where a large portion of the Virginia House on the upper stories were condemned, and many of the other rooms and buildings were barely habitable. One gem that came out of the 1950s and 60s and early 70s of the Orkney Springs Hotel really came about with the conductors' workshops that were held here by Dr. Lurt. In July and August, he would bring in conductors from all over the country and literally have workshops to help them learn how to conduct orchestras. And the story and the legend is that he would use the second floor of the Virginia House in the ladies' parlor to teach those conductors' workshops. And people would begin to sit on the lawn and listen to the workshops as they went on. And as I understand it, somebody finally went up to Dr. Lurt one day and asked if those workshops could at least play one song all the way through. And that began the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival. And we have hosted the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival since 1962 on the hotel property, and Shrine Mont, since we acquired the hotel in '79, has continued to host that that gem of the Shenandoah Valley. As I said, the hotel itself was falling apart literally in the 60s and 70s. And also the 1,200 acres that the hotel property consisted of was constantly discussed as being for sale to other developers. For Shrinemont, that was a definite threat because our place apart without the buffer of the hotel property would be just devastated. And after negotiations that probably lasted in excess of 10 years, Shrinemont and the then proprietor, Buddy Portlock, came to an agreement that Shrinemont would buy the entire property, all the buildings and all the land for an amount of money, and that the acquisition of the property would carry no interest on the loan. The Portlocks basically allowed Shrinemont to purchase the property to be payable over a number of years without interest, which enabled Shrinemont to acquire the property, and it also enabled the Portlocks to get what they thought they deserved for the value of the land and the property. So that happened in 1979. And when Shrinemont took over the facility, there were a number of conversations that had to be had at that time about the disposition of the buildings on the property. Again, our primary concern at Shrinemont was the acquisition of the property to protect Shrinemont from development. And what would happen next with the hotels was a conversation regarding the need for renovation, the need for Shrinemont to take out debt for the first time, and the amount of work that would have to be done to make it a feasible project. So in the early 80s, Shrinemont did some minor renovations to the Pennsylvania House and Maryland House to make them livable, but the conversation with the Shrinemont board really got to a head in the mid-1980s when it was clear that a large debt would need to be incurred to renovate the property as it should be renovated. And I am told that the board did have a vote to recommend to the bishop that Shrinemont take out the necessary loans to do the work, but that vote by the board was only a one-person margin. And it was that important a decision and that close a decision to make it happen. But once the decision was made to renovate the buildings, Shrinemont took off full force in a complete renovation, starting with the Virginia House in the mid-1980s. Literally jacking it up off the ground at first to renovate the entire foundation below, which was quite a sight to see it up in the air on jacks. And then later, after setting it back down and wrapping it up in plastic, the entire structure in a plastic bag to fumigate and get rid of all the bugs. And then after that work was done and everything was leveled off, they really were able to retain the entire inside of the building as it had initially been built. The guts of the building were all wood and were sound, and they used those as the foundation and the framework for the renovation. Through the 1990s, they finished renovating the Pennsylvania House, all the cottages, and finally the Maryland House. That was completed in 1992. And all the hotel rooms were completely gutted to have private bathrooms and the amenities that people come to expect even in the 1980s and 1990s. And with that renovation, Shrinemont kind of took on its new role as not just a quaint little retreat center for 300 people, but a conference center serving up to 600 people. Our food services, each dining room will now hold 300 people in one seating, and we have had conferences and groups of all sizes and all types. While we are a retreat center of the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Virginia, we are also a conference center open to anybody who wants to come and use the facility. We have no rules about who or what kinds of groups can come in, and we welcome family reunions, secular groups, large groups and small groups. We have our core camps for the youth. We have our own conferences for the church. We have about 120 parishes that come on retreat. And that's a major part of our business. But since we were established in 1979 as the current Shrine Mont, we have welcomed all kinds of groups and continue to work with the tourism industry in Shenandoah County and up and down the valley to welcome anybody who wants to come and use the facility. One important thing to note about the Orkney Springs Hotel property is that in 1976 it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And many think it's just the large Virginia house that actually is on the National Register, when actually it's the entire property designated as American Resort, a unique historical perspective reflecting a time where you just don't see these buildings anywhere anymore. We are very proud of that aspect of us. And as you look behind me and see a better view of the what was then Jersey Row, what we call the Cottage Row of houses, the Pennsylvania house and the Maryland house in the forefront with the large Virginia house behind it, you really get an appreciation for the historical value that we have here in Orkney Springs with the resort, and how seriously Shrine Mont takes our stewardship of the property. When Shrine Mont was established as a nonprofit organization in the 1980s, our own status, not the church's, it was for three purposes. The custodian of the cathedral shrine, which we've talked about, the work we have done in the arts with the Woodward Collection and the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival, and a number of camps for young people in the arts. And then finally, for our work in historic preservation in keeping this facility up and functioning as a vital part of Shenandoah County.